Copenhagen climate talks end in a grudging accord. After 2 weeks of delays, theatrics, and last-minute deal-making, the United Nations climate change talks have concluded with a grudging agreement by the participants to take note of a pact shaped by 5 major nations. The final accord, a 12-paragraph document, was a statement of intention, not a binding pledge, to begin taking action on global warming. A compromise seen to represent a flawed but supposedly essential step forward. Robert C. Orr, the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Policy and Planning, said that virtually every country had signaled that it would back the accord, and that "take note" was shorthand for acceptance. But many delegates of the 193 countries that had gathered here left Copenhagen in a sour mood, disappointed that the pact lacked so many elements they considered crucial, including firm targets for mid- or long-term reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, and a deadline for concluding a binding treaty next year. Even President Obama, a principal force behind the final deal, said the accord would take only a modest step toward healing the Earth's fragile atmosphere. Many participants also said that the chaos and divisiveness of the talks may signal the end of reliance on a process that for almost 2 decades had been viewed as the best approach to tackling global warming. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and a series of 15 conventions following a 1992 Climate Summit meeting in Rio de Janeiro. The process has become unworkable, many said, because it has proved virtually impossible to forge consensus among the many blocs of countries fighting over environmental guilt, future costs, and who should referee the results. The climate treaty process isn't going to die, but the real work of coordinating international efforts to reduce emissions will primarily occur elsewhere, said Michael Levi, who has been tracking the diplomatic effort for the Council on Foreign Relations. That elsewhere will likely be a much smaller group of nations, approximately 30 countries responsible for 90% of global warming emissions. It was these nations that Mr. Obama rallied in a series of dramatic encounters to finally ink a deal that theoretically starts a flow of financing for poor countries to adapt to climate change and sets up a system for major economies to monitor and report their greenhouse gas emissions. This smaller group of nations will meet periodically to tackle a narrow agenda of issues like technology sharing or the merging of carbon trading markets without the chaos of the United Nations process. A version of this already exists in the 17-nation Major Economies Forum, which has been a model of progress compared with what the world saw unfold at the climate talks. The deal worked out in Copenhagen is a political agreement forged by major emitters to curb greenhouse gases, to help developing nations build clean energy economies, and to send money flowing to cushion the effects of climate change. But even if countries live up to their commitments on emissions, a stark gap remains. measured in tens of billions of tons of projected flows of carbon dioxide between nations' combined pledges and what would be required to reliably avert the risk of disruptive changes in rainfall and drought, ecosystems, and polar ice cover from global warming, scientists say. The chances of success substantially hinge on whether Mr. Obama can fulfill his promises to reduce American greenhouse gas emissions and raise tens and tens of billions of dollars to help other countries deal with global warming. Of course, that in turn depends in large part on whether Congress takes action on a bill that puts a price on carbon and devotes a large part of the proceeds to foreign aid. And that is no sure thing. We have a lot of work to do on the road to Mexico, said the United Nations official who manages the climate negotiations, in reference to the next climate meeting to be held in Mexico City next year. Even reaching the tenuous accord in Copenhagen was a very tortuous path, culminating in an impassioned debate on the floor of the plenary meeting that lasted into the wee hours. Speaker after speaker from the developing world denounced the deal as a sham process fashioned behind closed doors by a club of rich countries and large emerging powers. The debate reached such a pitch that the Sudanese delegate likened the effort of the Accord on Poor Nations to the Holocaust. That set off a backlash, and many of the smallest and most vulnerable nations, while continuing to express reservations, began falling in line behind the deal. Ultimately, all but a handful of countries, Venezuela, Cuba, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia among them, went along with the decision to accept the document. Before the parties gathered in Copenhagen, the United States and China had been sniping at each other over various aspects of the proposed agreement, particularly over American demands that Beijing agree to a system of international monitoring through which its public promise to reduce the carbon intensity of its economy, the rate of emissions per unit of economic activity could be verified. But as that friction was growing, there was also significant progress on sharing clean energy technology and even exchanges between American and Chinese environmental officials over ways to accurately measure greenhouse gas emissions. This progress did not come easily, and we know that this progress alone is not nearly enough. President Barack Obama said, with no note of triumph in his voice. He added, "We've come a long way, but we have much further to go." So in other words, this is just really a promise to have another accord sometime in the future. Or so they say, if all goes well. And these are more signs of the end times, transition days. The transition is a process continuing every day all around the world.